There were kings in ancient Gaul who could lose a kingdom with a single cut of a blade, not a sword through the heart, not a battlefield defeat, a haircut. For the Merovingians, the long hair of the king was not fashion. It was not vanity. It was a public sign that the blood of rule still moved through him. To shear it away was to make a monarch into a man, to send him into a monastery, to bury him alive in plain sight. And that is where the mystery begins. Because long after these kings disappeared from power, their image refused to die. They remained half historical, half legendary. Warrior rulers, Christian founders, sacred-haired monarchs, and much later, the unwilling stars of modern bloodline fantasies. So we begin carefully, not with a secret society, not with a hidden gospel, not with a promise that every rumor is true. We begin with hair, power, memory, and the strange ability of a fallen dynasty to keep gathering shadows around its name. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. The story of the Merovingians is not simply the story of France before France had fully become France. It is the story of a world still cooling after Rome. Cities with old Latin names, bishops negotiating with warlords, families treating kingdoms like inheritances, and kings whose authority depended as much on symbol as on steel. Modern legend has often tried to make them into guardians of an impossible secret. But the older mystery is better and stranger because it is real. Why did people believe these rulers carried legitimacy in their bodies? Why did cutting their hair matter enough to end a reign? And why, centuries after their fall, did later generations look back at them and imagine that something hidden must have survived? The answer lies somewhere between archaeology, politics, religion, and myth, where history does not vanish, but changes shape. Before the Merovingians become kings in the full light of written history, they appear first as shapes at the edge of it. The setting is late Roman Gaul, a land that was not yet medieval France, but no longer securely Roman in the old way. Authority was thinning. Armies that once answered to emperors now depended on local commanders, federate peoples, and shifting alliances. Cities still carried the habits of Rome. Bishops still wrote in Latin. Coins, roads, laws, and titles still remembered an empire that had not vanished overnight. But power was changing hands, and the people who noticed it most clearly were not always the people who left the best records. This is one reason the beginning of the Merovingian story feels so difficult to hold. It does not arrive as a clean family tree, signed and sealed by reliable witnesses. It comes through later chroniclers, partial memories, political storytelling, and names preserved because someone, somewhere, needed the past to explain the present. Early Frankish history is not empty, but it is uneven. There are places where the ground is firm. There are places where it gives way beneath your feet. And in that uncertain ground, one name rises: Merovech. He is the figure from whom the Merovingians took their dynastic name. That fact alone made him important to later memory. A royal house does not choose an ancestor casually. To attach a line of kings to a founding name is to suggest continuity, destiny, and a kind of inherited right. But when we try to find Merovech himself as a flesh and blood ruler, the evidence becomes far less generous. According to later tradition, Merovech was a Frankish leader in the 5th century, connected to the turbulent period when Roman power in Gaul was weakening and Frankish groups were becoming more politically visible. Yet the details are blurred. His exact role, his achievements, and even the shape of his life remain difficult to establish with confidence. The legend may have grown larger than the man, and perhaps that was the point. This is not a failure of the story. It is part of the story. Dynasties often begin by reaching backward. Once a family has power, it needs origins. It needs a beginning old enough to command respect, but flexible enough to carry meaning. For the Merovingians, Merovech became that beginning. Not merely an ancestor, but a kind of doorway between history and myth. The evidence is thinner here, so we have to move with care. Some later accounts surround Merovech with extraordinary elements, including claims about a strange birth or supernatural association. Those traditions should be marked clearly as they tell us more about the imagination of kingship than they do about biology, and more about political memory than about a verifiable event. But legends, even when they are not factual, are not useless. A false origin story can still reveal what people wanted a king to be. It can show what kind of authority needed explaining. If a dynasty's founder is made mysterious, then the dynasty itself becomes harder to treat as ordinary. If his birth is placed near the border between the human and the otherworldly, then later kings inherit more than land. They inherit atmosphere. They inherit a suggestion that their rule comes from somewhere deeper than election, conquest, or convenience. That suggestion mattered in a world where power had to be recognized before it could be obeyed. The Franks of this period were not a single neat nation waiting to become France. They were a collection of groups, leaders, loyalties, and military followings moving within the collapsing architecture of Roman Gaul. Their rulers had to negotiate with Roman officials, rival Frankish chiefs, Gallo-Roman elites, bishops, and warriors whose loyalty was rarely abstract. A king was not just a man at the top of a pyramid. He was a center of gravity. People gathered around him because he could reward them, protect them, lead them, marry strategically, claim descent, and embody something larger than himself. This is where the shadowy origin of the Merovingians becomes politically useful. A dynasty with a mysterious ancestor could appear older than its paperwork. It could present itself as rooted in a past that no rival could easily disprove. And in an age when memory was carried as much by spoken tradition as by written record, uncertainty itself could become a kind of power. What is not fully known can be shaped. What is half remembered can be made sacred. Still, we should not imagine a secret royal bloodline already moving through the centuries with a single hidden plan. That is a modern habit projected backward onto a much messier world. The early Merovingians were not characters in a conspiracy novel. They were ambitious rulers in a fractured landscape, trying to survive in the ruins and remains of Rome. And then, after Merovech, the outline begins to sharpen. The next figure is Childeric, a name that no longer floats only in dynastic memory. With him, the story starts to leave the mist and touch the earth. We begin to find objects, weapons, gold, a ring bearing a royal image. The kinds of things that do not solve every mystery, but force legend to share space with archaeology. For now, though, the important thing is this. The Merovingians did not enter history as a finished dynasty. They emerged slowly, through broken sources and remembered names, in a world where Roman titles, Frankish power, Christian authority, and heroic ancestry all overlapped. Their beginning was never just a beginning. It was a claim. The first truly solid object in this story was not a crown. It was a grave. In 1653, in the city of Tournai, workmen uncovered a burial that changed the way later generations would look at the early Franks. Beneath the ground lay the tomb of Childeric I, a 5th-century king whose name had survived in written tradition, but whose world still felt remote, half-lit, difficult to measure. Then the earth opened, and suddenly there were things you could hold: a sword, a spear, gold ornaments, coins, and most importantly, a signet ring bearing the name and image of Childeric. That ring matters because it did something legends cannot do on their own. It fixed a royal name to a material object. It gave the past a face, even if that face was stylized, formal, and shaped by the artistic language of its time. Childeric was no longer only a figure moving through the uncertain pages of late antique memory. He had weight. He had a burial. He had possessions arranged around him with intention. The grave did not explain everything. Archaeology rarely does. It does not lean close and whisper motives. It does not tell us what a king feared at night, or whether the men who buried him loved him, resented him, or simply obeyed the ceremony expected of them. But it does something colder, and in some ways, more powerful. It refuses to let the story drift away. Childeric's tomb pulled the Merovingians down from legend and placed them in the soil of northern Gaul. And what the grave revealed was a world of mixture. The burial goods speak of a ruler standing between traditions. There are weapons, unmistakably. Childeric belonged to a warrior aristocracy, a world in which power had to be demonstrated physically and militarily. A king was expected to command men who understood the language of violence, loyalty, treasure, and victory. No amount of ancestry could save a ruler who could not gather armed followers around him. But the signet ring tells another part of the story. A signet is not only decoration, it is administration. It is recognition. It belongs to a world of documents, authority, seals, names, and public identity. The image of Childeric on that ring suggests a ruler who did not simply stand outside the Roman world, smashing at its gates like a convenient barbarian stereotype. He operated within its remains. He borrowed its symbols. He understood the value of appearing as a legitimate authority in a landscape where Roman habits had not vanished. This is where the grave becomes more than treasure. It becomes an argument against simplicity. For a long time, the popular imagination has liked to divide this era into neat categories: Rome on one side, barbarians on the other, civilization collapsing, warriors taking over. But Childeric's tomb complicates that picture. The early Merovingian world was not a clean replacement of one culture by another. It was an entanglement. Frankish leaders could be fierce military figures and participants in a Romanized political order. They could wear authority in several languages at once. That may be one reason the dynasty survived where others faded. The Merovingians were not powerful because they were pure representatives of some untouched ancient Frankish past. They were powerful because they were adaptable. They could speak to warriors through gifts and victory. They could speak to Gallo-Roman elites through titles, symbols, and continuity. They could speak to bishops, eventually, through patronage and religion. Their legitimacy was not one single thing. It was layered. And in Childeric, we see the layering begin to take visible form. The tomb at Tournai also reminds us how fragile historical memory can be. The discovery was famous. The objects became part of royal and scholarly fascination. But many of the original grave goods were later stolen, and much was lost. That loss is almost too fitting. The Merovingians keep giving us evidence, then withdrawing it. A ring remains in memory. A burial catalogue remains. Drawings and descriptions remain. Enough to anchor the story, but not enough to make it complete. History, especially this far back, is often built from survivals that were never meant to become evidence. Childeric did not arrange his grave for modern historians. His burial was not a museum display waiting politely for discovery. It was a statement made within his own world. The weapons, ornaments, and royal signs were not random luxuries. They presented an identity. They said, "This man mattered. This man commanded. This man belonged to a kind of authority that deserved to be recognized even after death." And the people who buried him seem to have understood the importance of that message. A royal tomb is not only about the dead. It speaks to the living who remain. It reassures followers that the line continues. It reminds rivals that this was no ordinary family. It gives a successor a usable memory, a prestigious father, a buried proof of greatness. In a dynasty where ancestry mattered deeply, the grave of a king could become a political resource. Childeric's son would make far greater use of that inheritance. But before we move to Clovis, it is worth pausing with the tomb itself. Because the discovery at Tournai gives the Merovingian story its first hard edge. It tells us that behind the later myths stood men whose power was practical, visible, and carefully staged. They were not simply mysterious long-haired figures drifting through folklore. They commanded armies. They negotiated status. They were buried with symbols meant to survive them. There is a temptation, when dealing with legends, to become disappointed when the evidence turns ordinary. A grave, a weapon, a ring. No hidden map, no sacred code, no bloodline sealed beneath a cathedral floor. But that disappointment is a mistake. The ordinary evidence is more revealing. A ring with a king's name may not prove a secret destiny, but it proves a world in which identity had to be performed and preserved. A sword may not tell us the full story of conquest, but it reminds us that royal legitimacy in this age was never just ceremonial. Gold ornaments may not unlock a mystery, but they show how wealth, beauty, and authority could be gathered around a body and made to speak. Childeric's tomb does not answer the question of why the Merovingians became legends. It gives us the first clue. They became legends because, from the beginning, they understood the power of signs. Childeric gave the dynasty a body in the ground. Clovis gave it a kingdom. His name has survived with a force that most early medieval rulers never achieve. Not because every detail of his life is perfectly preserved. It is not. Not because later writers left us a neutral portrait. They did not. Clovis comes to us through sources shaped by Christian memory, dynastic pride, political need, and the simple human pleasure of turning a hard, ambitious ruler into the hero of a larger story. But even after we strip away the Polish, something formidable remains. Clovis was the Merovingian king who took a regional Frankish power and turned it into something far larger. He fought rivals, absorbed territories, defeated enemies, and expanded Frankish authority across much of Gaul. In the process, he did more than win battles. He changed the political direction of the post-Roman West. At the beginning, the Franks were one force among several. Gaul was crowded with competing powers. Roman authority had broken into fragments. Local elites still mattered. Bishops could hold communities together when imperial administration failed. Other kingdoms stood nearby, some stronger, some older, some better established. The Visigoths held a major place in the south. Burgundian power mattered in the east. Roman military traditions had not simply evaporated. This was not an empty map waiting for Clovis to color it in. He had to carve his way through a landscape of survivors. One of his most important victories came against Syagrius, a ruler often associated with the last Roman authority in northern Gaul. The exact labels can mislead us here. Syagrius was not Rome in the clean imperial sense of earlier centuries, and Clovis was not simply an outsider breaking civilization apart. Both men belonged to a world after empire, where Roman identity, military command, local legitimacy, and armed power had become tangled together. But the defeat of Syagrius mattered because it opened space. It allowed Clovis to extend his control into territory where Roman political habits still carried weight. That was one of his gifts. He understood that conquest was not enough. A warrior could take land. A king had to hold it, and holding Gaul meant dealing with its Christian population. This brings us to the moment that later tradition made central to Clovis's memory: his conversion to Nicene Christianity. It is one of those events that can become too simple when repeated too often. The old version is easy to tell. A pagan king faces danger in battle, calls on the Christian God, wins, converts, and becomes the founder of a Christian kingdom. It has the shape of a miracle story, and later Christian writers had every reason to present it that way. But the historical meaning is subtler and probably more important. Clovis's conversion did not merely change his private beliefs. It changed the language through which his rule could be understood. In a region where many powerful Gallo-Roman elites were Nicene Christians, and where bishops had become indispensable public figures, the choice connected Clovis to an existing network of moral authority, literacy, urban influence, and social trust. It gave him a way to appear not just as a conqueror over Gaul, but as a ruler acceptable within Gaul. This point is easy to underestimate. In the modern imagination, religion is often treated as something separate from politics, or as a mask placed over politics after the real decisions have been made. In Clovis's world, that division does not work. Faith, legitimacy, diplomacy, identity, patronage, and power were woven together. A king's religious alignment affected whom he could marry, whom he could trust, which bishops might support him, which communities might accept him, and how later generations would remember him. Clovis's baptism, then, was not a decorative ceremony at the edge of the story. It was a political transformation with spiritual language. That does not mean it was cynical. We should be careful with modern assumptions. People in this world did not always separate sincere belief from strategic advantage. A ruler could believe in divine power and also recognize that conversion helped him govern. A bishop could celebrate a king's baptism and also know that a baptized king might protect church property, support councils, and punish enemies. The sacred and the practical did not cancel each other out. They strengthened each other. This is where Clovis becomes foundational, not because he invented Christian kingship, and not because he created France in the modern national sense. That would be too neat. But he placed the Merovingian house at the center of a new political reality. a Frankish monarchy rooted in conquest, but increasingly expressed through Christian legitimacy. After Clovis, the dynasty could claim more than descent from a mysterious ancestor. It could claim divine favor. It could stand beside bishops. It could sponsor churches and monasteries. It could make war while speaking the language of orthodoxy, sin, repentance, and providence. That combination would shape medieval monarchy for centuries. And yet Clovis himself should not be softened too much. The Christian founder was also a ruthless dynast. Later accounts describe him eliminating rival Frankish rulers and consolidating power with a coldness that feels less like saintly kingship and more like the practical cruelty of survival. We do not need to accept every anecdote at face value to see the pattern. Clovis was not remembered only because he was pious. He was remembered because he won. That is the tension at the heart of his legacy. Blood and baptism sit side by side. A king could kneel before the font and still be dangerous. A dynasty could be embraced by the church and still be drenched in family violence. Christianity did not make Merovingian politics gentle. It gave them a new framework, new allies, new rituals, and new ways to explain victory and authority. It did not remove ambition. It consecrated it. There is something almost unsettling in that. The story of Clovis is often told as a beginning, and it is one. But it is not the beginning of a clean Christian order replacing a chaotic pagan past. It is the beginning of a more complicated arrangement, where sacred language and armed force learned to live together. The king's sword did not disappear beneath the baptismal water. It came out with a blessing. For the Merovingians, this changed everything that could be said about power. A ruler no longer had to be merely strong, wealthy, descended from the right line, or marked by the old symbols of royal identity. He could also be a protector of the faith, a patron of holy men, a participant in the divine ordering of the world. His victories could be interpreted as signs. His enemies could be framed not only as political rivals, but as obstacles to a Christian future. This did not make the dynasty invincible, far from it. But it made it harder to dismiss. The Merovingians had begun as a family with obscure origins, emerging from the fractured borderlands of Roman memory. With Childeric, they became visible through the language of grave goods, military status, and royal display. With Clovis, they became something larger, a dynasty able to fuse Frankish power with the Christian institutions of Gaul. That fusion did not resolve the mystery of their legitimacy. It deepened it. Because from this point onward, a Merovingian king was not only a war leader, he was not only a descendant, he was not only the long-haired bearer of a royal line. He was also a Christian monarch, standing in a world where bishops could bless, chroniclers could remember, and ritual could make conquest look like destiny. Clovis understood, perhaps better than anyone before him in the family, that a kingdom is not built by violence alone. It must be narrated into existence. And after his baptism, the Merovingian story had a new narrator, the Church. Clovis's baptism did not end the old world. It gave the old world a new grammar. That distinction matters, because the Merovingian kingdom was never a place where religion floated above politics in some pure, untouched realm. It entered the bloodstream of power. It gave kings a language for legitimacy, bishops a role in government, monasteries a reason to receive royal favor, and ordinary communities a way to imagine their ruler as something more than the strongest man with the largest armed following. After Clovis, the Merovingians could not simply be judged by the number of warriors they commanded. They also had to be seen in churches. They had to be named in prayers. They had to be remembered by men who wrote in Latin, kept records, preserved saints' lives, advised rulers, managed urban communities, and understood very well that a king's favor could protect land, privilege, and survival. The alliance between the Merovingian house and the Christian institutions of Gaul was not a single agreement signed on a table. It was built gradually, unevenly, through gifts, councils, appointments, conflicts, burials, marriages, and acts of patronage. Sometimes it looked like devotion. Sometimes it looked like negotiation. Often, it was both. A king might grant property to a monastery because he believed the prayers of monks mattered for his soul. He might also do it because monasteries were stable institutions in an unstable landscape, places that could anchor royal influence across distance. A queen might sponsor a church out of sincere piety, but that same foundation could become a dynastic monument, a sacred place where memory settled around her name. A bishop might praise a ruler as chosen by God, while also nudging him toward decisions that protected episcopal authority. No one in this world needed to choose between faith and strategy as neatly as we sometimes expect them to. That is where modern readers often misunderstand early medieval Christianity. We are tempted to ask whether religion was real or political, as though it must be one or the other. For the Merovingians, religion was real enough to shape fear, hope, law, death, and salvation. It was also political enough to decide alliances, inheritance, public order, and reputation. The two categories were not enemies. They occupied the same room, and kings knew it. To rule in Gaul after Clovis meant ruling a land where bishops were among the most important public figures left standing. The old Roman machinery had weakened, but the church had inherited much of its discipline. Literacy, correspondence, networks across cities, moral authority, and a sense of institutional continuity. Bishops did not merely perform ceremonies and retreat politely into the background. They could mediate disputes. They could condemn behavior. They could preserve memory. They could make a king look righteous, or make his enemies look cursed by their own disorder. For a dynasty with violent succession habits, that mattered. The Merovingians did not enjoy a peaceful family culture. Their politics often turned brothers, uncles, nephews, widows, sons, and stepchildren into rivals. Kingdoms were divided, recombined, fought over, and divided again. In that environment, legitimacy had to be constantly defended. Birth alone helped, but it did not settle every claim. Victory helped, but victory could look like murder if no one gave it a moral frame. Religion offered that frame. A king who defeated a rival could present himself as the restorer of order. A ruler who endowed a church could soften the memory of violence. A queen who founded a monastery could transform personal grief, ambition, or danger into holy purpose. Even exile could become religiously meaningful. A defeated royal might be sent into monastic life, not simply locked away like an ordinary prisoner, because monastic enclosure had a symbolic weight that prison did not. It removed the person from politics while wrapping that removal in sacred discipline. This is one of the quiet engines of Merovingian survival. Their authority rested not only on force, but on translation. Brutal acts had to be translated into order. Family rivalry had to be translated into legitimate succession. Royal wealth had to be translated into piety. A dynasty that could master those translations could endure contradictions that might otherwise destroy it. Of course, the church was not merely a tool in royal hands. That would be too simple and too flattering to kings. Bishops and abbots had their own interests, their own rivalries, their own memories of insult and favor. They could benefit from royal patronage, but they also helped define what good kingship looked like. A Merovingian ruler might support a monastery, but the monks and clerics who remembered him could decide what kind of ruler later generations believed he had been. This gave Christian writers an extraordinary power. They did not control every battlefield, but they often controlled the afterlife of reputation. That afterlife could be generous. It could also be sharp. A violent king might be remembered through stories of divine punishment. A generous queen might be preserved as a model of sanctity. A political marriage might be described as providence, alliance, scandal, or disaster, depending on who wrote the story and why. In a world where written history was scarce, the person holding the pen could make a life appear blessed or poisoned. The Merovingians needed the church, but they also exposed themselves to its judgment. This relationship produced a monarchy that was never purely sacred and never merely secular. It was something more unstable, a kingship that had to keep proving that its violence served a higher order. When that proof was convincing, the dynasty looked chosen. When it failed, the same sacred framework could make royal failure seem like moral decay. That is the dangerous bargain hidden inside baptism. Once a king claims divine favor, his disasters can also be read as divine commentary. The Merovingians gained legitimacy through Christian alliance, but they also entered a world of Christian expectation. They were measured against ideals they could not consistently meet. Justice, restraint, protection of the poor, defense of the church, proper treatment of kin, reverence for holy places. The gap between royal behavior and sacred language could be wide. Sometimes it was almost abyssal, but the gap itself tells us something important. The Merovingian world was not hypocritical simply because kings prayed and killed, endowed monasteries and betrayed relatives, honored saints and pursued revenge. It was a world struggling to fuse two powerful inheritances, the warrior politics of a ruling family and the moral universe of Christian Gaul. The result was often uneasy. But uneasy does not mean superficial. It means alive. This is why monasteries and churches became more than religious sites in the Merovingian story. They were archives of loyalty. They were family memorials. They were safe places for dangerous people. They were centers of wealth and learning. They were spiritual investments, political landmarks, and sometimes the only institutions strong enough to outlast the ambitions of the people who funded them. A royal gift to a monastery could say many things at once. Pray for me. Remember me. Support my children. Legitimize my rule. Forgive what I have done. Do not forget my name. That final desire may have been the most human of all. The Merovingians ruled in a world where death came easily and political memory could be brief. A king might win a battle and still be murdered by kin. A queen might outmaneuver rivals and still find herself trapped by the next turn of succession. In such a world, religious patronage promised a different kind of survival, not immortality in the modern fantasy sense, but continuity. a name spoken at an altar, a tomb protected by sacred walls, a family story attached to a holy place. This is where blood and baptism became inseparable. Blood gave the Merovingians their claim to rule. Baptism gave that claim a Christian vocabulary. Patronage gave it visible form. Bishops gave it public recognition. Monasteries gave it memory. Together, these things helped turn a dynasty of ambitious Frankish warlords into something harder to dislodge from the imagination. A royal house whose authority seemed to pass through both the body and the soul. And yet, the same religious world that strengthened them could not prevent the family from tearing its inheritance apart. A kingdom blessed by bishops could still be divided among sons. A Christian dynasty could still produce rival courts, jealous queens, suspicious brothers, and heirs raised to believe that land, people, treasure, and title were all part of the family estate. The church could bless the monarchy, but it could not make the Merovingians stop being Merovingians. That contradiction would shape everything that followed. Because once the kingdom became an inheritance, every royal birth became a future border. A Merovingian kingdom could look united from a distance. From close up, it behaved like a family inheritance with an army attached. That is one of the most important differences between the way we imagine kingdoms and the way Merovingian rulers often treated them. We tend to picture a realm as a single political body, something that survives its ruler and passes intact to one successor. One crown, one throne, one map, a clean transfer, at least in theory. The Merovingians lived inside a less tidy logic. For them, the kingdom was both one thing and many things. It was a shared royal inheritance belonging to the dynasty, but it could be divided among sons. Land, cities, revenues, followers, and claims were distributed like family property, even though the people living inside those territories might prefer not to be handed around as if they were silver cups from a dead man's hall. This did not mean the Franks had no sense of a larger realm. They did. The idea of a Frankish kingdom remained meaningful. But beneath that larger identity, power fractured again and again because royal blood created multiple legitimate claimants. A son was not automatically a spare part. He was a potential king. That single fact made every succession dangerous. After Clovis died, his achievements did not pass smoothly into one pair of hands. His sons divided the kingdom among themselves. This was not an accident or a momentary lapse in judgment. It reflected a broader dynastic habit. The royal inheritance could be partitioned, recombined through death or conquest, and partitioned again. The map of Merovingian power became less like a finished wall and more like a piece of cloth being cut, stitched, torn, and restitched across generations. At first, this system may have seemed practical. Dividing the inheritance could reduce immediate conflict among heirs by giving each son a share. It acknowledged the claims of royal children and allowed several branches of the family to enjoy kingship at once. In a warrior society, where adult male heirs expected status, wealth, and followers, excluding too many princes might have produced rebellion even faster. But the solution carried its own poison. Every partition created borders where brothers had interests. Every court became a rival center of memory and ambition. Every nephew, widow, uncle, and half-brother might one day become useful to a faction. And because each ruler could claim Merovingian blood, disputes were rarely between a legitimate king and an obvious outsider. More often, they were fights inside legitimacy itself. That is a colder kind of conflict. When an outsider attacks, a dynasty can unite against him. When the threat comes from within the royal family, every act of violence can be presented as restoration. Each claimant can say he is not destroying the kingdom, but saving his rightful share of it. The language of family becomes the language of war. Over time, several names begin to matter in this divided landscape: Neustria, Austrasia, Burgundy, and Aquitaine. These were not modern nation-states, and we should resist the urge to draw them too sharply in our minds. Their borders shifted, their political weight changed. Their identities were shaped by geography, aristocratic networks, older Roman cities, military followings, and the ambitions of the kings who ruled them. But they became recognizable centers of power within the Merovingian world. Neustria, in the west, was tied to the old heartlands of northern Gaul and the political gravity of places that could connect Frankish rule with Gallo-Roman tradition. Austrasia, in the east, looked toward the Rhine and the Frankish military frontier, with powerful aristocracies of its own. Burgundy carried the memory of an older Burgundian kingdom absorbed into the Frankish sphere, but not erased as a political reality. Aquitaine, further south, had its own character, its own elites, and a relationship with Frankish power that could be uneasy. Together, these regions made the Merovingian realm rich, varied, and difficult to control. They also made it vulnerable to personality. A strong ruler could temporarily gather the pieces and make the kingdom feel whole again. A weak ruler, a child ruler, or a disputed succession could reveal how much depended on negotiation. Local aristocrats watched carefully. Bishops watched carefully. Queens watched with particular care, because marriage and motherhood could determine which child controlled which portion of the inheritance. Men with military followings watched too, because a divided dynasty made room for ambitious servants to become indispensable. This is where the story begins to bend toward a larger tragedy. The Merovingians had created a system in which royal blood was everywhere important, but central authority was repeatedly weakened by the very abundance of royal heirs. The dynasty's strength, its sacred family identity, its inherited right, its pool of legitimate princes, became a source of instability. Too many kings could be almost as dangerous as too few. It is tempting to call this foolish. Some later observers did, but that judgment is a little too comfortable. The Merovingians were not simply failing to understand monarchy. They were operating under assumptions different from later centralized kingship. A kingdom, to them, could be a patrimony, something held by the royal house and shared among its male descendants. The problem was that people are not fields, and political authority is not a loaf of bread. Divide it enough times, and you do not merely create smaller portions. You create rival futures. The repeated partitions also changed the emotional texture of politics. Succession was not an abstract legal process. It was intimate. A brother's death might open opportunity. A nephew's survival might be a threat. A royal widow might become the guardian of a child king, and therefore the center of a political network. A marriage might unite claims or import danger into a court. A baptismal name, a burial place, a tutor, a noble household. All of these could become political facts. In such a world, family could not remain private. A royal household was not just where the king lived. It was where factions formed, where children were protected or exposed, where women negotiated influence, where servants carried messages, where rumors hardened into decisions. The walls between domestic life and public power were thin enough to be almost imaginary. This is why the divided kingdom matters beyond maps. It produced a culture of permanent calculation. No one near the throne could afford innocence for long. A prince's childhood might be watched like a military frontier. A queen's pregnancy could change the balance between regions. A marriage bed could matter as much as a battlefield, because it might produce the next claimant around whom an entire aristocratic party could gather. The Merovingian kingdom was not collapsing at every moment. It endured for generations, which means the system had resilience as well as danger. Divisions could be managed, alliances could be made, kings could cooperate, at least temporarily. Shared dynastic identity did not disappear simply because the inheritance was divided. The family name still mattered. The long hair still mattered. The aura of royal blood still mattered. But each partition made authority more negotiable. And once authority becomes negotiable, those who negotiate well become powerful. This is the quiet opening through which other figures begin to rise. Mayors of the palace, aristocratic families, court officials who understood that a king did not have to vanish in order for power to move elsewhere. In a divided realm, the person who controlled access, resources, military support, and administration could become more than a servant. He could become the hinge on which the kingdom turned. For now, the kings still stood at the center of the ritual world. They were still the visible bearers of Merovingian legitimacy. They still belonged to the bloodline that others had to recognize. But beneath them, the political floor was shifting. The realm had become a family inheritance. The inheritance had become a set of rival courts. The rival courts had become theaters of ambition. And in those theaters, some of the most consequential players were not always the men wearing the crown. Power in the Merovingian world did not always sit where later imagination expects it to sit. It did not remain neatly on the battlefield, or in the royal hall, or beneath the crown. Sometimes it stood beside a marriage bed. Sometimes it waited in a nursery. Sometimes it moved through a queen's household, in the guarded spaces where children were raised. Letters were carried. Alliances were whispered into shape. And the future of a kingdom could depend on which woman survived long enough to protect her son. This is not a decorative corner of Merovingian history. It is one of its central chambers. Royal women in this dynasty were not simply background figures, placed there to soften a brutal age or provide tragic color between the actions of men. Their position was dangerous precisely because it mattered. A queen could connect two families. She could bring prestige, wealth, land, or diplomatic advantage. She could become the mother of heirs, the protector of minors, the patron of churches, the focus of aristocratic loyalty, and, in moments of crisis, the person around whom an entire political faction gathered. In a kingdom divided among brothers and cousins, motherhood could be a claim to power. That claim was never simple. A queen's authority was often indirect, negotiated, and vulnerable to attack. She could not always command openly in the way a king commanded. But influence does not need to be obvious to be real. In a court society, access was power. Proximity was power. The ability to shape a child king's household, to reward servants, to sponsor holy places, to correspond with bishops, to make or break a marriage arrangement. These were not small things. They were the machinery of survival. And the Merovingian court had very little room for innocence. Because succession turned family into strategy, royal marriage became a form of statecraft with a pulse. A bride entering a court did not simply become a wife. She entered a nest of expectations. Her children might inherit one portion of the realm. Her rivals' children might inherit another. Her relatives might gain influence, or be feared because of it. Her personal standing could rise or collapse depending on childbirth, favor, scandal, widowhood, and the shifting loyalties of men who smiled at feasts and counted soldiers afterward. In such a world, private feeling was never safely private. Love, jealousy, humiliation, grief, ambition, all of these emotions could become political events when they touched the royal family. A quarrel inside the household might alter alliances beyond the palace. A second marriage could threaten the inheritance of sons from the first. The birth of a child could create hope in one faction and terror in another. A widow might be expected to withdraw, but if her son was young and royal, she could become the most important person standing between him and removal. This is why the stories of Merovingian queens often feel so intense. Not because early medieval women were uniquely scheming, as hostile sources sometimes imply, but because their arena of action was built out of pressure. The court forced them to convert vulnerability into strategy. A queen who failed to protect herself could be discarded. A queen who failed to protect her children might watch their inheritance disappear. A queen who succeeded too visibly could be accused of overreaching. The sources do not always help us see them fairly. Many of the accounts were written by men of the church, men with their own moral assumptions, political loyalties, and anxieties about female influence. A powerful queen could be praised as pious, generous, and wise if her patronage aligned with the writer's world. Another could be remembered as dangerous, manipulative, or morally corrupt if she stood on the wrong side of a conflict. The evidence is not useless, but it must be handled with care. The portrait may tell us as much about the fears of the observer as about the woman being observed. This is especially important when we meet the famous rivalries of the Merovingian age. Later memory often reduces them to personal hatred, as if entire kingdoms trembled because two women simply could not endure one another. There may have been hatred, there may have been insult, loss, and the kind of grief that hardens into policy. But to treat dynastic violence as court gossip with sharper knives is to miss the structure beneath it. These rivalries were not only emotional dramas, they were succession crises wearing human faces. A queen's anger could matter because her son's claim mattered. A marriage could become explosive because it rearranged access to inheritance. A death in the family could open territory, treasure, and allegiance. The court was intimate, but the stakes were enormous. Here, the Merovingian habit of dividing kingdoms among heirs created a particularly dangerous role for women. Every queen mother stood at the intersection of bloodline and territory. She was tied to one branch of the dynasty, one set of children, one cluster of aristocrats, one memory of promises made and broken. If her husband died, she might become exposed, but she might also become essential. A child king needed guardians, advisors, defenders. Whoever controlled the child could influence the kingdom in his name. That fact made royal children precious. It also made them vulnerable. A boy with Merovingian blood was not just a boy. He was a possible future around which men could rally. His hair, still growing, might someday become the visible sign of royal legitimacy. His existence could threaten an uncle, strengthen a mother, tempt an aristocrat, or justify rebellion. In a dynasty where the body of the king carried symbolic meaning, The bodies of children mattered before they understood why. There is something chilling in that. The Merovingians made blood sacred enough to rule, but dangerous enough to kill for. And women lived closest to that danger. They managed households where the next generation of claimants was raised. They navigated courts where affection could not be separated from calculation. They used religious patronage not only as devotion, but as protection and memory. A monastery founded by a queen could become a refuge, a shrine, a political signal, and a written argument for her virtue. In a violent world, holiness could be a shield, not always strong enough, but worth raising. This does not mean every queen was a mastermind, secretly directing the kingdom from behind a curtain. That would be another lazy story, the mirror image of pretending they did nothing. Their power varied. Some were constrained. Some were destroyed. Some were remembered unfairly. Some clearly shaped events with a force that even hostile writers could not erase. The better truth is more interesting. Merovingian queens operated inside a system that gave them no safe position, only possible leverage. They could be used as symbols of alliance, then become political actors in their own right. They could be judged by motherhood, then use motherhood as authority. They could be praised for piety, then turn piety into a network of influence. They could be blamed for violence that grew from the dynastic structure itself. And that last point matters. When modern readers encounter tales of royal women accused of cruelty, intrigue, or vengeance, it is worth asking what the accusation is doing. Is it describing a real action? Possibly. Is it moralizing a political conflict? Often. Is it placing responsibility for systemic violence onto a convenient female figure? Sometimes. The evidence does not allow easy innocence, but it also does not justify easy caricature. The Merovingian court was not peaceful until women interfered. It was already built for conflict. The divisions of the kingdom created rival heirs. Rival heirs created factions. Factions created propaganda. Propaganda needed villains. Queens, visible enough to matter and vulnerable enough to attack, could be made to carry the blame for ambitions shared by many. Yet they also left traces of agency that cannot be brushed aside. Through marriages, regencies, patronage, and the defense of children, they helped determine which branches of the family survived. They shaped the sacred geography of the dynasty through religious foundations. They influenced how royal memory was preserved. They stood at the point where domestic life became public history. This is the shadowed political world behind the more familiar image of long-haired kings. A king's hair might proclaim his legitimacy to the realm, but someone had to keep that king alive as a child. Someone had to negotiate his marriage. Someone had to defend his inheritance when his father died. Someone had to build alliances around him before he could command them himself. Very often, that someone was a woman whose name later writers treated with suspicion because they could not deny her importance. So when we speak of Merovingian power, we should not imagine only crowned men riding between divided kingdoms. We should imagine rooms within rooms. A queen weighing whether a marriage will save her child or endanger him. A widow calculating which bishop might speak for her. A young prince watched by servants who know his hair is not merely hair. A court where every cradle is also a claim. In that world, the family was the state, and the state entered the family like a blade slipped quietly beneath a door. The Merovingians did not only inherit kingdoms, they inherited each other. There are many ways to remove a king. You can defeat him in battle. You can imprison him. You can turn his nobles against him. You can persuade a bishop to bless another man. You can wait for sickness or arrange for something less patient. But in the Merovingian world, one of the most powerful acts was also one of the simplest. You could cut his hair. To modern eyes, this can seem almost absurd. Hair grows. Hair can be hidden under a hood. Hair feels too personal, too fragile, too close to fashion to carry the weight of a kingdom. We live in a world where a ruler's authority is supposed to come from constitutions, elections, institutions, laws, armies, wealth, ideology, things more durable than a braid or a shoulder-length mane. But symbols do not need to be physically strong to be politically dangerous. A flag is only cloth until people agree to die for it. A crown is only metal until a kingdom recognizes it. A signature is only ink until a court enforces it. The long hair of the Merovingian kings worked in a similar way. It was a visible sign that the man before you belonged to the royal line, that his body carried a legitimacy other men could not simply imitate. The hair did not make him king by itself, but without it, he could cease to look like one. That distinction is crucial. The Merovingian king's long hair should not be treated as fantasy, as though every strand possessed magical power. The better reading is stranger because it is more human. The hair was a public language. It turned the body into a political document. It said, before a word was spoken, that this man was not merely noble, not merely rich, not merely armed, but royal. And because the sign was public, its destruction had to be public too. A shorn Merovingian was not just humiliated, he was altered in the eyes of the political community. The cutting of the hair announced that the body no longer carried the same claim. It was a ritual unmaking, a way of saying that the royal sign had been removed and that the man who once stood at the center of power had been reduced to another status. Often, that status was monastic. This is one of the reasons the Merovingian tonsure feels so severe. The defeated king was not always killed. Sometimes he was placed into a monastery, where his political life could be ended beneath the appearance of religious withdrawal. It was a solution that combined mercy, symbolism, and containment. He remained alive, which could look Christian and restrained. But he was also removed from the world of marriage, heirs, warriors, and courtly access. His hair was cut. His royal visibility was broken. His future became enclosed. It was exile with a sacred roof. There is a cold intelligence in that arrangement. Killing a royal rival could create martyrdom, outrage, or blood feud. Leaving him free could invite rebellion. But cutting his hair and sending him into monastic life changed the meaning of his body. He was not simply a king who had lost a fight. He was a man ritually redirected away from kingship. The monastery did not merely hold him, it reclassified him. This tells us how deeply Merovingian kingship depended on signs that everyone in the political world understood. Long hair was not a private eccentricity of the dynasty. It was legible. Aristocrats knew what it meant. Bishops knew what it meant. Rival kings knew what it meant. The drama of shearing only worked because the audience already understood the symbol being destroyed. A secret sign is useful for hidden groups. A royal sign must be seen. That is why the hair mattered so much in a society where kingship was embodied. The Merovingian ruler did not rule only through documents or institutions. He ruled through presence. He was recognized in assemblies, courts, processions, churches, banquets, and military gatherings. His body stood before men whose loyalty depended on seeing the marks of rank, lineage, and authority. A king had to appear as a king before people would treat him as one. The long hair made lineage visible. This may also explain why the symbol endured even when royal power weakened. A king could lose practical authority to palace officials. He could depend on aristocrats to govern. He could become increasingly ceremonial, but as long as he bore the signs of Merovingian legitimacy, he remained useful. He could authorize what others did. He could provide continuity. He could sit in the place where tradition expected a king to sit. In that sense, the hair became more important, not less, as real power drifted away. When politics is strong, symbols can seem decorative. When politics is uncertain, symbols become anchors. The Merovingians understood this instinctively, or at least their world did. A long-haired king could be weak and still necessary. He might not command the machinery of government, but he embodied the dynasty that made the machinery appear lawful. He was the living seal on acts performed by stronger men. That is both majestic and tragic, because a king reduced to symbol is still dangerous. He can be used, displayed, hidden, replaced, or ritually destroyed. His body becomes a battlefield others can control. The very sign that makes him legitimate also makes him vulnerable. Hair can be cut. A prince can be tonsured. A royal child can be placed in a monastery before he ever becomes a threat. The symbol protects, but it also provides a target. This is the darker side of sacred kingship. When legitimacy is attached to the body, violence against the body becomes political speech. A coronation raises the body. A tonsure lowers it. A royal burial preserves it. A mutilation can disqualify it. A marriage can extend it into the next generation. A child's birth can multiply it. These are not just personal events. They are transformations in the political order. The Merovingians were not alone in treating the royal body as meaningful, but their hair gave that meaning an unusually visible form. It was not hidden beneath legal formulas. It did not require a scholar to interpret. Anyone who knew the code could look and understand. The king's authority flowed through blood, but the hair announced that blood to the world. And yet there is a paradox here. The long hair made the Merovingians look ancient, almost untouched by ordinary politics. It suggested continuity, sacred inheritance, a line set apart. But the ritual cutting of that hair reveals the opposite. Kingship was fragile. It depended on recognition. It could be revoked by the right people performing the right act at the right moment. A sacred sign is powerful only while a community agrees that it is powerful. Once that agreement changes, the sign becomes vulnerable to reinterpretation. A king with uncut hair could be honored as the bearer of royal blood. A king with cut hair could be recast as a monk, a penitent, a harmless relic of a failed claim. The same body, altered by a blade, entered a different story. This is why the Merovingian hair remains so memorable. It condenses an entire political world into one image. In that image, we see ancestry, charisma, ritual, masculinity, violence, religion, humiliation, and fear. We see a dynasty trying to make power visible in an age when written institutions were not enough. We see rivals learning that the easiest way to destroy a royal claim was not always to spill blood. Sometimes it was enough to remove the sign that made the blood visible. For later generations, this detail became irresistible. The long-haired kings seemed to belong halfway to history and halfway to myth. Their hair gave them a visual mystery that could be exaggerated, misunderstood, and eventually dragged into modern fantasies about sacred bloodlines. But before any of that, before the secret societies and speculative genealogies, there was the older and more disciplined mystery. Why did a society agree that hair could carry the weight of rule? The answer lies in a world where kingship was not abstract. It had to be seen. It had to be touched. It had to be inherited through bodies, confirmed by ritual, remembered by churches, defended by warriors, and accepted by those powerful enough to make acceptance matter. The Merovingian king's hair was not magic. It was more dangerous than magic. It was a sign everyone believed they understood. And when a sign like that is cut away, a kingdom hears the blade. There is a point in the Merovingian story where history takes one step sideways and something older, stranger, and more difficult to classify enters the room. Not through archaeology, not through a grave, not through a royal seal, a battlefield, or a church council. Through a story. According to a later tradition associated with the Chronicle attributed to Fredegar, Merovech, the shadowy ancestor whose name gave the dynasty its identity, was connected to a mysterious sea creature, sometimes described through the strange name Kinotaur. The account is brief, obscure, and difficult to interpret. It has tempted generations of readers to lean in too closely, as though the entire secret of the Merovingians might be hidden inside that single monstrous image. But this is exactly where caution becomes important. More than that, it belongs to the world of political myth, not verifiable biography. We cannot treat it as evidence that Merovech was literally fathered by a beast from the sea, or that the Merovingian dynasty carried some supernatural blood. That would be reading the legend as if it were a laboratory report, which is one of the fastest ways to misunderstand the past. Still, the story is not meaningless. Myths do not need to be factually true to reveal what a culture was trying to say. The sea beast tradition tells us that, at some point, someone imagined the origin of the Merovingian line as something not entirely ordinary. The founder was not merely born. He was surrounded by ambiguity. His ancestry was pushed toward the border between human and otherworldly, between dynastic memory and sacred strangeness. In a royal culture already concerned with bodily signs, inherited charisma, and visible legitimacy, that kind of origin story could do important work. It made the dynasty feel set apart. A king descended from ordinary men can be challenged by ordinary men. A king whose line begins in mystery is harder to measure. He stands partly inside history and partly outside it. His authority can be described as older than law, deeper than election, stranger than conquest. The uncertainty becomes part of the aura. This does not mean everyone believed the story literally. We should not imagine a Merovingian court where practical warriors sat around earnestly debating marine monsters before launching campaigns. Early medieval people were capable of political intelligence, irony, skepticism, and layered reading. A myth could function as entertainment, warning, prestige, insult, explanation, or all of these at once. The Kinotaur story may have been a way to magnify the dynasty. It may also have been a way to unsettle it. That is one of its most interesting features. A supernatural origin can glorify a royal house by suggesting divine or heroic ancestry. But a monstrous origin can also carry danger. It can imply excess, impurity, violence, or a power that does not fit comfortably inside Christian order. The same story that makes a dynasty seem special can also make it seem suspicious. And that ambiguity is very Merovingian. Their kingship was never one simple thing. It carried Christian baptism and older royal symbolism. It stood beside bishops while preserving bodily signs that felt almost archaic. It produced saints and killers, patrons and rivals, sacred language and family bloodshed. A sea beast in the ancestry is not a fact we can confirm, but as a symbol, it belongs perfectly to a dynasty whose legitimacy always seemed to hover between blessing and threat. Later imagination would not resist this. Modern readers, especially those hungry for hidden bloodlines, have often treated the sea beast legend as an opening, a crack through which almost anything can be inserted. Once a royal origin sounds strange enough, the temptation is to keep adding strangeness. Secret marriages, sacred descendants, hidden heirs, suppressed documents, coded genealogies. The mind enjoys a pattern, even when the evidence does not support it. Give it a monster in the water, and soon it may build an entire underwater palace. But the older question is better. Why would a royal dynasty want or tolerate a founding story that makes its own beginning so strange? One answer is that early kingship often needed more than politics. It needed charisma in the old sense, an authority that felt charged, exceptional, not fully reducible to ordinary calculation. In a world where rulership depended on recognition by warriors, aristocrats, bishops, and communities, a founding myth could help create that charge. It could say, "This line is not like other lines. Its kings are marked. Their bodies matter. Their descent carries force. The long hair of the Merovingians made legitimacy visible in the present. The origin myth made it mysterious in the past. Together, they formed a powerful combination. A man could stand before the realm with the hair of a Merovingian king, and behind him stretched a family memory that did not begin with paperwork. It began in the uncertain distance, where ancestors became larger than life, and the boundary between history and legend grew soft. That softness was useful. It allowed different audiences to hear different meanings. A warrior might hear strength. A court might hear antiquity. A rival might hear threat. A Christian writer might hear something that needed taming within the story of providence. A later mythmaker might hear an invitation to invention. This is why we have to separate two different things. There is the historical Merovingian dynasty, whose rise can be studied through texts, archaeology, politics, religious institutions, and material culture. And there is the mythic Merovingian dynasty, a figure of imagination that later centuries repeatedly remade. The sea beast belongs mostly to the second category. It does not tell us who Merovech really was. It tells us how later memory could dress a royal beginning in the language of marvel. And marvel is powerful. A plain genealogy can be copied. A marvelous genealogy is remembered. That may be the hidden function of the story. Not to provide information, but to preserve fascination. The stranger the origin, the harder the dynasty is to forget. A king descended from a list of respectable fathers may be legitimate, but he is not necessarily memorable. A king whose ancestor is linked to something rising from the sea leaves a mark on the imagination. The image is almost impossible to domesticate. A woman at the shore, a creature from the water, a child whose name will become the name of kings. Again, we must keep the word close to this scene. We cannot enter it as fact, but as legend, it has a kind of symbolic precision. The sea is a borderland. It hides what it carries. It brings things from elsewhere. It suggests depth, danger, fertility, and invasion all at once. To connect a dynasty's origin to the sea is to make that dynasty feel as though it came from beyond the ordinary horizon. For the Merovingians, whose real history was already rooted in the unstable meeting of Roman, Frankish, Christian, and oral traditions, such an image is not random. It gives visual form to a deeper truth. Their origins were never clean. They emerged from mixture, from empire and frontier, from memory and ambition, from the need of later generations to explain why this family, and not another, had once seemed chosen to rule. The sea beast myth also reminds us that historical legitimacy is not made only from facts. That may sound dangerous, because it is. Political communities have always used stories to explain power. Some of those stories are honest simplifications. Some are sacred traditions. Some are propaganda. Some are old rumors that hardened into identity. Once attached to a dynasty, they can outlive the conditions that created them. The Merovingians fell from power, but their origin stories did not fall with them. They waited, and centuries later, when modern writers came looking for hidden kings and sacred bloodlines, they found exactly the kind of material that could be stretched into something much larger than the evidence allowed. A mysterious ancestor, long-haired monarchs, a strange birth legend, a dynasty displaced but not forgotten. It was all too tempting. But temptation is not proof. The Kinator tradition should not lead us into fantasy dressed as research. It should lead us into a more careful insight. Early medieval kingship was not embarrassed by mystery. It used mystery. It shaped political authority through symbols, bodies, ceremonies, stories, and origins that could not always be checked against a ledger. That does not make the Merovingians supernatural. It makes them human. Humans have always wanted rulers to be more than administrators. Even when we claim to want sober institutions, we remain drawn to signs, bloodlines, founding fathers, sacred relics, heroic ancestors, national myths, chosen families, lost heirs. We want power to have a story. We want authority to feel as if it came from somewhere. The Merovingians had such a story. Not a clean one, not a fully trustworthy one, but a story with teeth, salt water, and the uneasy suggestion that kingship might begin in places ordinary people were not meant to see clearly. So the myth of the sea beast does not solve the mystery of the dynasty. It teaches us how the mystery was made. A real family rose in late Roman Gaul, fought, converted, ruled, divided its inheritance, and marked its kings with long hair. Around that real family gathered legends that made its beginning deeper, stranger, and more difficult to dismiss. The legend may have grown larger than the event itself, but it preserved a truth about royal power that bare facts sometimes miss. A dynasty is not remembered only because it ruled. It is remembered because people kept finding meanings inside it. And in the case of the Merovingians, one of those meanings came from the water, dark, disputed, and impossible to shear away. By the time the Merovingian kings began to lose real control, they did not immediately lose their crowns. That is the strange part. A dynasty can fall in a single coup, with doors broken open, guards replaced, and a new ruler announcing that history has changed its mind. But the Merovingian decline was more subtle than that. It was a long transfer of weight. Power did not vanish from the royal house all at once. It slipped sideways, piece by piece, into the hands of men who were supposed to serve the king. The title that matters here is Mayor of the Palace. At first glance, it sounds almost harmless, even domestic. A modern ear might imagine someone supervising rooms, meals, servants, schedules, an important manager, perhaps, but not the kind of figure who could bend a kingdom. That impression is misleading. In the Merovingian world, the palace was not merely a residence. It was the moving center of royal government, patronage, access, treasure, military coordination, aristocratic negotiation, and dynastic influence. To control the palace was to control the doorway through which power passed. A mayor of the palace could decide who reached the king. He could manage royal resources. He could speak to nobles, command loyalties, and build networks that lasted longer than any single court quarrel. And as the Merovingian realm remained divided among rival branches, these officials became more than administrators. They became anchors for regional aristocracies. In Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy, the mayor could stand between the king and the great families whose support made rule possible. If the king was young, weak, absent, distracted, or trapped within ceremonial expectation, the mayor's influence could grow until service became command in all but name. This is not the story of one villain stealing a kingdom from one helpless king. It is more interesting than that, and less theatrical. The rise of the palace mayors was the result of a political system that needed someone to make it work. Repeated partitions had created rival courts. Child kings created regencies and guardianships. Aristocratic families expected rewards, offices, marriages, and military leadership. The church expected protection and patronage. Armies required organization. Land had to be granted. Disputes had to be settled. Someone had to keep the machinery moving when the sacred-haired king was too young, too weak, or too enclosed by ritual to do it effectively. The mayors stepped into that necessity, and necessity, repeated long enough, becomes authority. The most dangerous kind of power is often the kind that begins as usefulness. A man who solves problems becomes hard to remove. A man who controls access becomes impossible to ignore. A man who commands the loyalty of other powerful men can eventually stop pretending that his authority is merely borrowed. He may still act in the king's name, but everyone in the room knows where decisions are truly being made. This created a peculiar political arrangement. The Merovingian king remained symbolically essential. His bloodline still carried legitimacy. His long hair still marked him as royal. His presence could authorize acts and preserve continuity. He was the face of the old order, the living proof that the dynasty had not broken. But beneath that face, the hands doing the work increasingly belonged to someone else. A hollow kingship is not necessarily an irrelevant kingship. That is the key. The late Merovingian kings were not powerless because symbols had no value. They were powerless in a world where symbols had enormous value, but practical command had moved away from them. Their sacred status made them useful to the men who governed in their shadow. A mayor of the palace did not need to abolish the king at first. Abolition would have been risky. It might provoke resistance. It might appear illegitimate. It might disturb the delicate agreement by which aristocrats, bishops, and warriors recognized authority. Far easier to rule through the king. This is one reason political decline can be so difficult to see while it is happening. The outer forms remain intact. The king is still there. The ceremonies continue. Documents may still bear royal authority. The old names are still spoken, but the center has shifted. What looks like continuity from far away may feel very different to those standing close to the court. They know who must be persuaded. They know who controls the treasure. They know whose anger matters. They know whose favor opens the door. In the Merovingian case, the palace mayors did not rise in empty space. They rose because the dynasty itself had created openings, divided inheritance, regional rivalry, child succession, dependence on aristocratic support, and the increasing importance of administrative control. The king remained sacred, but sacredness alone could not command every army, settle every feud, and reward every noble family. A dynasty that had once fused blood, baptism, and war now needed men who could translate those claims into daily rule. The mayors became translators. Then they became masters of the language. Especially in Austrasia, the mayoral office became the base for families whose ambitions were larger than service. Their influence did not depend only on proximity to a king. It came from land, kinship, military success, noble support, and the ability to present themselves as protectors of order. Once a mayor could win battles, distribute rewards, and speak for the kingdom more effectively than the king, the old hierarchy began to look ceremonial rather than practical. Still, ceremony could not be dismissed. That is why the Merovingians lasted as long as they did. A purely decorative dynasty would have been easy to discard. But they were not decorative in the shallow sense. They were dynastic symbols wrapped in centuries of recognition. Their bodies carried memory. Their hair carried public meaning. Their descent still separated them from ordinary aristocrats, even powerful ones. The mayors could wield authority, but they had to confront a stubborn fact. Everyone knew they were not Merovingians. For a long time, that mattered. A mayor might govern, command, and dominate, but the king's name still offered a kind of covering. The Merovingian presence made radical change unnecessary. It allowed the real rulers to avoid asking the most dangerous question too early: who has the right to wear the crown? As long as the old king remained useful, the question could be postponed. But postponed questions have a way of growing heavier. The more the mayors ruled, the more absurd the arrangement became. A king who did not govern still possessed the title. A servant who governed still lacked it. The contradiction did not destroy the system immediately, because medieval politics could tolerate contradictions when they served stability. But it created tension. Every successful mayor made the next step more imaginable. Every weak king made the old reverence look thinner. Every victory won by a non-king placed another stone on the wrong side of the scale. The dynasty had once survived by mastering symbols. Now its enemies had learned to use symbols too. They did not begin by attacking Merovingian sanctity head-on. They surrounded it. They managed it. They acted in its name. They allowed the long-haired king to remain visible while reducing the space in which his will mattered. This was not the destruction of kingship, but the separation of kingship into two parts: the sacred sign and the effective ruler. For a time, those parts could coexist, but they could not coexist forever, because symbols, however powerful, need believers who find them useful. Once the men with armies, land, church connections, and aristocratic support decided that the sign no longer matched the reality, the Merovingian king became exposed. His hair still proclaimed legitimacy, but legitimacy was being renegotiated around him. There is a quiet cruelty in that. A weak king may still inherit the burden of sacredness. He may still carry the visible sign of a dynasty whose great days are behind it. He may still sit where Clovis's descendants sat, bearing the memory of conquests he did not make and rituals he did not create. But memory cannot govern by itself. It can bless power. It can delay change. It can make rebellion look like sacrilege, until the moment someone finds a stronger blessing. That moment had not quite arrived yet. For now, the Merovingian kings remained, long-haired, recognized, increasingly managed. They were not phantoms. They were not inventions. They were still necessary enough to preserve, but not strong enough to command. Around them, the mayors of the palace accumulated the habits of rule until habit hardened into expectation. The dynasty became a shrine with officials living inside it. And one day, one of those officials would decide that the shrine no longer needed its original saint. In the end, the Merovingian dynasty was not overthrown by pretending it had never mattered. It was overthrown because it had mattered too much. That is what makes the fall of Childeric III in 751 so revealing. The last Merovingian king did not simply disappear because a stronger man wanted his throne. Stronger men had wanted many things before. What made this moment different was that the old symbolic order was finally judged insufficient by those powerful enough to replace it. The king still had the name. He still belonged to the ancient royal house. He still carried in his body the long-haired sign of Merovingian legitimacy. But by this point, effective power had passed elsewhere. The mayors of the palace, especially the family that would become known through the Carolingians, had built the authority that the kings increasingly lacked. They commanded armies. They cultivated aristocratic support. They presented themselves as defenders of order. They had become rulers in practice, while the Merovingians remained rulers in form. For a while, that imbalance could be endured. Then Pepin, called the Short, forced the question that everyone around power already understood. Should the man who possesses the title be king, or the man who possesses the authority? It was a dangerous question, because if answered carelessly, it could sound like nothing more than ambition dressed in philosophy. Many men with soldiers have claimed that reality should recognize them, but Pepin did not rely on force alone. He sought a higher confirmation, one that could transform usurpation into legitimate succession. He turned to the papacy. That papal support mattered enormously. It did not simply hand Pepin a crown like a prize. It gave a sacred argument to a political fact. The old Merovingian kings had long depended on Christian legitimacy, on bishops, on the church's ability to frame power as lawful and even providential. Now that same Christian language could be redirected. The blessing that had once strengthened the dynasty could be used to justify its replacement. There is a sharp irony in that. The alliance between monarchy and church, which had helped Clovis's descendants become more than a warrior family, now helped end them. In 751, Childeric III was deposed. Pepin became king, and the Carolingian dynasty began. But the detail that gives the moment its deep symbolic force is not only the political transfer, it is the ritual humiliation that accompanied it. Childeric was shorn. His long hair was cut away. Then he was sent into monastic life. After all the wars, conversions, partitions, court rivalries, and palace maneuvers, the fall of the dynasty returned to the symbol with which we began. The hair, the visible sign, the royal body made into public language. To remove Childeric's hair was to say that the old claim had been severed, not merely defeated, not merely outmaneuvered, severed. This was not a small gesture. It was the final sentence in a centuries-long argument about what made a king a king. If Pepin had only imprisoned Childeric, the old king might remain a living focus of loyalty. If he had killed him, he might have stained the new dynasty with unnecessary sacrilege, or created a memory too dangerous to control. But the tonsure offered a cleaner transformation. It moved Childeric from the royal world into the religious one. It removed him from succession, marriage, military leadership, and public kingship. It left him alive, but politically emptied. A cut of hair became a change of category. The man who had been king became a monk. This is why the ritual is so haunting. It shows that the Carolingians understood the Merovingian symbol even as they destroyed it. They did not laugh it off as superstition. They did not ignore it as meaningless. They attacked it precisely because it was meaningful. They knew the old royal sign had to be neutralized before the new order could feel secure. The last long-haired king had to become visibly no longer long-haired. Only then could the new king appear fully king. And yet we should be careful not to treat Childeric III as the tragic hero of a romantic fall without evidence for his inner life. We know the outline of his deposition far more clearly than we know the man. He is remembered largely because he was last. That is a difficult kind of immortality. He stands at the end of a dynasty whose greatest figures came before him, carrying the burden of a name already weakened by generations of political drift. He may have been personally weak. He may have been more a symbol than an actor. But symbols can suffer real consequences. The fall of Childeric was not simply the fall of one man. It was the formal admission that Merovingian blood, by itself, no longer commanded obedience. The world had changed around the dynasty. The men who governed wanted the title to match the power. The church had become willing to bless that alignment. Aristocrats had reason to accept it. The sacred aura of the old house had not vanished overnight, but it had become negotiable. Once sacredness becomes negotiable, it is already in danger. Pepin's rise also tells us something important about continuity. The Carolingians did not present themselves as destroyers of Christian monarchy. They presented themselves as its correction. That is often how successful regime change works. It does not say, everything before us was meaningless. It says, the true meaning of the old order is now fulfilled in us. The Merovingians could be removed, but kingship itself remained. The crown did not die. The blessing did not die. The alliance with the church did not die. The idea of a Christian ruler governing the Franks did not die. Only the family that had once embodied it was stripped of its role. This is why 751 feels less like an ending than a transfer of sacred machinery. Pepin and his descendants inherited more than land. They inherited a political language the Merovingians had helped create. Kingship marked by Christian approval, dynastic legitimacy, ritual confirmation, and the careful use of public signs. The Carolingians changed the ruling house, but they did not abandon the stage. They took command of it. Still, the old dynasty left one final lesson behind. Power can remain visible long after it has become hollow. Childeric's hair may have proclaimed him king, but it could not summon the military strength, aristocratic loyalty, or ecclesiastical support needed to save him. The sign remained potent enough to require destruction, but not potent enough to prevent it. That is the narrow and tragic space in which the last Merovingian stood, still too sacred to ignore, no longer strong enough to rule. When his hair fell, it was not simply a personal disgrace. It was the public ending of a grammar of authority. For nearly 3 centuries, the Merovingians had carried kingship in their bodies, in ancestry, in ritual, in hair, in blood, remembered by followers and interpreted by the church. Their legitimacy had survived violence, partitions, child rulers, rival queens, and the rise of men who governed around them. But by the middle of the 8th century, the old formula no longer held. The man with the blood was no longer the man with the power. The man with the power found the blessing, and the blessing changed sides. That is how the long-haired kings ended, not in a blaze of heroic resistance, not in a hidden escape, not in the birth of a secret heir beneath a moonlit sky, but in a calculated ritual of removal. A blade passed through hair. A king entered a monastery. A new dynasty stepped forward with holy approval. History often changes less dramatically than legend wants it to. But sometimes, the quiet gestures are the most brutal. Childeric III's tonsure was one of those gestures. It reduced a dynasty to the thing that had once made it visible. It took the symbol that had proclaimed royal blood and turned it into evidence of defeat. The Merovingians had begun in uncertain memory, risen through war and baptism, and survived for generations through the power of signs. They ended when another family learned how to cut the sign away. After Childeric III was shorn and sent away, the Merovingians no longer ruled. But they did not disappear. That is one of history's quieter tricks. A dynasty can lose armies, palaces, titles, and the obedience of the great families, yet remain alive in memory with a force that power itself can no longer command. The Merovingians became politically extinct, but imaginatively useful. They turned into an origin, a beginning, a buried layer beneath later France, and origins are rarely allowed to rest in peace. The Carolingians had replaced them, but replacement is not the same as erasure. Pepin and his descendants needed the old dynasty to be finished, not forgotten beyond recognition. A completely meaningless Merovingian past would make the transfer of kingship look like a mere seizure. A once legitimate dynasty, now weakened and rightly displaced, was far more useful. It allowed the new rulers to say, in effect, the old line had served its time, and now authority had passed into stronger hands. That is a delicate kind of memory. The Merovingians had to remain royal enough for their fall to matter, but not powerful enough to threaten the new order. So they became ancestors without being models in every respect. They were remembered as early kings of the Franks, founders of a royal past that later generations could organize into a grand sequence. Medieval and later French tradition would eventually speak of them as the first race of kings, the earliest royal house in a long story that continued through Carolingians and Capetians. The phrase itself carries a sense of distance. The first race is not the present. It is the old root, half buried, still necessary for the tree. This is where their afterlife becomes fascinating. While they ruled, the Merovingians were often unstable, violent, divided, and politically improvised. After they fell, they could be rearranged into something more orderly. The first chapter of France's royal memory. Their messy world of rival courts, contested inheritances, and sacred hair became part of a larger national genealogy. Later, people looked backward and found not confusion, but ancestry. That act of looking backward changes what is seen. To the people living through Merovingian politics, the realm was not yet the France of later imagination. It was a Frankish kingdom, or rather a set of Frankish kingdoms, rooted in late Roman Gaul and shaped by many peoples, regions, and institutions. But later memory prefers lines. It likes to draw a path from then to now, even where the real road twisted, broke, doubled back, and passed through country no one had planned to cross. The Merovingians became part of that line. They were useful because they stood near the beginning of so many later claims. The Christian monarchy of the Franks could look back to Clovis. The royal ancestry of France could look back past the Carolingians to the long-haired kings. The Church could remember the conversion that tied Frankish power to Nicene Christianity. Chroniclers could arrange kings into succession, impose order on dynastic fragments, and make the past speak in a more disciplined voice than it had ever possessed while alive. But memory also darkened them. The later image of the Merovingians was not simply noble. It carried a sense of strangeness, decline, and almost primitive sacredness. Their hair remained memorable. Their origin stories remained odd. Their political violence remained vivid. Their removal by a more administratively successful dynasty made them seem like relics of an older type of kingship. Charismatic, bodily, ancestral, but ultimately unable to survive the harder machinery of Carolingian rule. That contrast helped shape their legend. The Carolingians could be imagined as reformers, empire builders, partners of the papacy, rulers of a more expansive Christian order. The Merovingians, by comparison, became the older race, less polished, more shadowed, closer to the uncertain border between Roman collapse and medieval formation. They were not prehistoric, but they could feel that way from the perspective of later centuries. They belonged to the dark first rooms of the house, and because the evidence for those rooms was incomplete, imagination moved in. This is a pattern repeated throughout history. When a dynasty leaves behind too little documentation for comfort, but too many strange symbols to ignore, it becomes a magnet. Gaps invite stories. Ambiguous details gain weight. A missing motive becomes a hidden motive. A ritual becomes a code. A ruined line becomes a secret line. The fewer answers the archive gives, the more confidently fantasy sometimes speaks. The Merovingians were especially vulnerable to this transformation. They had a mysterious, eponymous ancestor. They had a legendary sea beast tradition attached to their origin. They had kings whose uncut hair visibly marked royal status. They had a dramatic deposition through tonsure. They had a real connection to the Christianization of Frankish kingship. They had disappeared from power without disappearing from royal memory. None of these details proves a secret hidden bloodline. But together, they create an atmosphere that later myth could exploit. The dynasty felt as though it should contain a secret, even when the evidence points instead to politics, ritual, and memory. That feeling, the sense that there must be more beneath the surface, is one of the most powerful engines of historical legend. The irony is that the real history is already rich enough. The Merovingians do not need modern embellishment to be strange. They ruled a world where a haircut could end kingship, where queens fought through dynastic networks, where bishops gave moral shape to royal violence, where a grave could preserve the image of a king for centuries, where a family inheritance became the map of political conflict. Their reality is not plain. It is only less convenient than conspiracy. But legends often prefer convenience. A secret bloodline is easier to grasp than the slow formation of early medieval political culture. A hidden king is cleaner than a century of divided inheritance. A forged document may feel more exciting than the hard work of reading late antique sources with caution. The mind wants a locked door. Sometimes history offers no locked door, only a room badly lit, with objects scattered across the floor. The Merovingian afterlife begins in that badly lit room. They became the first royal layer beneath France, not because they secretly controlled the future, but because later people needed a beginning old enough to dignify the present. Every monarchy wants roots. Every nation, once it begins telling its own story, looks backward for ancestors. The Merovingians were there, waiting, early, royal, Christianized, violent, memorable, and distant enough to be shaped. This does not mean their memory was entirely invented. Far from it. They really did rule. Clovis really did matter. Childeric's tomb really did anchor the dynasty in material history. The partitions really did shape the kingdom. The rise of the palace mayors really did hollow out royal authority. Childeric III really was removed, and the symbolic force of cutting royal hair was not a modern fantasy. The problem begins when memory is asked to do more than evidence permits. A remembered dynasty can become an ancestral foundation. That is normal. It can become a symbol of lost sacred kingship. That is understandable. But when it becomes proof of a concealed plan running beneath European history, we have left the discipline of history and entered the theater of desire. For centuries, the Merovingians waited mostly in chronicles, royal genealogies, antiquarian curiosity, and the long memory of French kingship. They were strange, but not yet the center of the modern mystery industry. Their name belonged to medievalists, historians, clerics, and those who cared about the early Franks. Then the 20th century found them. And the 20th century did not come empty-handed. It brought forged documents, secret societies, speculative genealogies, and a hunger for hidden explanations beneath official history. It brought readers eager to believe that the fallen kings had not merely ended, but gone underground. It brought a new kind of myth, one that dressed itself not in sea beasts and royal hair, but in archives, codes, dossiers, and claims of suppressed truth. The medieval legend had made the Merovingians mysterious. The modern world would make them conspiratorial. That shift tells us less about the 6th century than about ourselves. We are not so different from the people who gave kings monstrous ancestors or sacred hair. We still want power to have an unseen source. We still imagine that blood can carry destiny. We still suspect that a lost dynasty might not be lost at all, only hidden from view. The Merovingians survived because they occupied the perfect space between fact and emptiness. There was enough history to anchor belief, enough legend to invite wonder, enough loss to leave room for invention, and enough royal aura to make the invention feel meaningful. So, after the last king entered monastic obscurity, the dynasty remained beneath the surface of European memory, not alive in a political sense, but not dead in the imaginative one. It became the old root that later storytellers could touch when they wanted to speak of beginnings, sacred rule, fallen blood, and the possibility that history had buried more than it confessed. The Merovingians had lost the kingdom, but they had gained something almost as durable. They had become an unfinished story. The 20th century did not invent the Merovingians. It reinvented what people wanted from them. For a long time, these kings belonged mostly to the difficult territory of early medieval history, a world of fragmentary sources, dynastic partitions, church politics, archaeology, and the slow formation of Frankish power. Then, in the modern imagination, they were pulled into a very different kind of story. Not the story of late Roman Gaul, not the story of bishops and palace mayors, not even the story of sacred hair. The new story was about blood, secret blood, hidden blood. A royal line supposedly moving beneath the surface of European history, protected by coded documents, guarded by secret societies, and waiting to be recognized by those clever enough to read the signs. It is a dramatic idea, and for that reason it traveled far. But drama is not evidence. The modern obsession with the Merovingian bloodline is bound up with a set of claims that became famous in the 20th century, especially those involving the so-called Priory of Sion and speculative works such as the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. These claims suggested, in various forms, that the Merovingians were connected to a sacred lineage of extraordinary importance, sometimes tied to theories about descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. We need to be very clear here. These claims are disputed, and the central documentary foundations behind many of them have been widely rejected. The Priory of Sion, as it appeared in modern conspiracy literature, is not accepted by mainstream historians as an ancient secret order protecting a Merovingian sacred bloodline. Much of the modern material associated with it has been exposed as unreliable, fabricated, or built upon documents that do not withstand scrutiny. That does not mean the story had no power. It means its power came from desire, not proof. And desire can be remarkably persuasive when it dresses itself like research. The modern bloodline myth worked because it connected several things people already found magnetic: a fallen dynasty, a mysterious origin, strange royal customs, the loss of power, the possibility of hidden heirs, the idea that official history is not merely incomplete, but deliberately misleading, the suggestion that religion, monarchy, and secrecy are all parts of one suppressed truth. Once those pieces are placed on the table, the pattern feels almost self-assembling. The Merovingians were perfect for this treatment because they were real enough to anchor speculation, but distant enough to resist easy correction in the public mind. Most viewers and readers know something about the Roman Empire, Charlemagne, or the later kings of France. Far fewer know the details of 6th and 7th century Frankish succession. That gap creates a kind of open territory. Into that territory, modern mythmakers could pour genealogies, symbols, hints, and associations. The result was not medieval history. It was modern mythology using medieval materials. This distinction matters because the bloodline theories often depend on a particular style of persuasion. They do not usually prove their case in a direct way. Instead, they gather suggestive fragments. A name here, a symbol there, a legendary origin, a disputed document, a coincidence of geography, a noble family with an attractive genealogy. Each piece, examined alone, may be weak, but placed together in a darkened room with the right narration, they begin to glow. That glow is not the same as light. A responsible historian asks what the evidence actually shows, where it comes from, who produced it, when it appears, and whether independent sources confirm it. A conspiracy narrative often asks a different question. What could this mean if the hidden story were already true? That shift is subtle and dangerous. It turns every uncertainty into support. Missing evidence becomes evidence of suppression. Contradiction becomes proof that someone is hiding the truth. Silence becomes suspicious simply because it is silence. The Merovingians, unfortunately for them, had enough silence to be useful. Their early origins were blurred. Their founder was wrapped in legend. Their sacred hair looked unusual to modern eyes. Their last king was ritually removed. Their memory survived in French royal tradition. These are all genuine historical features, but none of them proves a secret sacred bloodline. They prove something more grounded, and in some ways more revealing. That early medieval kingship depended on lineage, symbolism, ritual, and memory. The modern myth takes those real ingredients and changes the recipe. It turns dynastic legitimacy into mystical biology. It turns political memory into hidden instruction. It turns the fall of a royal house into the beginning of a secret mission. It turns gaps in the record into doorways, and people walked through those doorways eagerly. Part of the appeal came from the mood of the 20th century itself. This was an age that had seen official institutions lie, empires collapse, churches lose authority, archives open, governments conceal information, and mass media transform rumor into spectacle. Suspicion became a kind of cultural instinct. Many people were ready to believe that the public version of history was only the surface layer, and that beneath it lay a second history known to initiates. The Merovingians were ideal inhabitants of that second history. They were ancient, but not too famous, royal, but defeated, Christian, but surrounded by older symbols, documented, but not completely. They seem to invite the phrase, "what if," and "what if" is the favorite doorway of modern legend. What if the dynasty did not truly end? What if the sacred hair was a sign of something more than kingship? What if the sea beast myth concealed a coded origin? What if later genealogies preserved a secret too dangerous to reveal? What if the official story is only the edited version? These questions can be entertaining. They can even be useful when they force us to examine assumptions. But they become misleading when they pretend that possibility is evidence. History is full of things that could be imagined. The discipline lies in asking which of them can be supported. For the Merovingian bloodline theories, the support is not strong enough. The more extraordinary claims collapse under scrutiny. The documentary trail is compromised. The genealogical leaps are too convenient. The interpretations often depend on reading symbols as codes without a reliable key. And the emotional force of the story tends to run ahead of what the sources can bear. Yet the myth refuses to die. That refusal is worth studying, not because it proves the secret is real, but because it reveals something about modern hunger. The bloodline obsession offers a strange comfort. It suggests that history is not random, not broken, not merely a sequence of accidents, wars, marriages, and institutional changes. It suggests that behind the chaos there is a hidden continuity, a family, a plan, a secret inheritance, a truth preserved by those who knew better than the crowd. This is a deeply human fantasy. It takes the mess of history and gives it a pulse. It says that the past is not lost, only concealed. It says that the rightful king may not be on the throne, but somewhere in the blood. The truth continues. It says that the world has a hidden architecture, and that we might be able to discover it if we follow the clues. The Merovingians became useful because they already stood at the border between fact and legend. Modern writers did not have to invent their strangeness from nothing. They only had to redirect it. The long hair became more than a royal sign. The mysterious ancestor became more than a dynastic namesake. The fall of Childeric III became more than a political replacement. Each detail was lifted from its historical setting and made to serve a larger, unsupported design. That is the danger of atmosphere without discipline. A real mystery invites careful attention. A manufactured mystery invites surrender. The difference is not always obvious at first, because both can feel thrilling. Both can make the viewer lean forward. Both can whisper that the surface is not enough. But the real mystery grows sharper when evidence is tested. The manufactured one grows vaguer, more elaborate, more resistant to correction. It survives by moving the goalposts deeper into secrecy. And so the Merovingians entered popular culture not only as early Frankish kings, but as possible guardians of a hidden sacred past. That transformation says almost nothing reliable about Merovech, Childeric, or Clovis. It says a great deal about us. We are drawn to lost dynasties because they make absence feel meaningful. We are drawn to bloodline stories because they turn inheritance into destiny. We are drawn to secret societies because they make confusion feel organized. And we are drawn to disputed documents because they give us the sensation of forbidden access, even when the door opens onto a room built from smoke. The real Merovingians do not need to be descendants of a sacred secret to matter. They mattered because they helped shape Christian kingship in the West. They mattered because their symbols carried political force. They mattered because their divided inheritance created the conditions for new forms of power. They mattered because their fall helped make way for the Carolingian order. They mattered because later France looked back and found in them its first royal lair. But the modern bloodline obsession wanted something else. It wanted them not as history, but as proof that history had been hiding a king. That is a powerful story. It is also, as far as the evidence allows us to say, not a proven one. So we should leave the secret bloodline where responsible history leaves it, disputed, widely rejected, and revealing less about the early Middle Ages than about the modern appetite for concealed meaning. Still, the appetite remains, and in that appetite, the Merovingians found their second kingdom, not over Gaul, not over Neustria or Austrasia, but over the imagination of people who wanted the past to contain a locked chamber and wanted these long-haired kings to be holding the key. The strange thing about forged history is that it often succeeds, not because people are foolish, but because the forgery knows where people are wounded. It knows what they want to be true. A fake document placed before a completely indifferent audience is only paper, But a fake document placed before an audience already hungry for secret order can become a door. People do not merely read it, they enter it. They bring their disappointments, suspicions, longings, and private theories with them. The document does not have to carry the whole burden of belief. It only has to give shape to a desire that was already waiting. That is why the modern Merovingian mystery gained traction, not because its foundations were strong, because its emotional architecture was. The claims surrounding secret Merovingian bloodlines, hidden heirs, and the Priory of Sion did not appear in a vacuum. They arrived in a culture already fascinated by conspiracies, esoteric religion, alternative histories, and the idea that official institutions had concealed the most important truths. The 20th century had taught people, sometimes with good reason, that governments could lie, churches could protect themselves, archives could be selective, and respectable authorities could be wrong. Suspicion became easier to market, and the Merovingians were perfect raw material. They offered just enough reality to make invention feel disciplined. They were not fictional kings. Childeric, Clovis, and Childeric III were not imaginary. The dynasty had ruled. It had converted. It had been displaced. It had carried strange royal symbols. It had survived in memory as the first royal race of France. So when later writers placed unsupported claims on top of that foundation, the whole structure could appear more solid than it was. This is one of the oldest tricks of unreliable history. Anchor speculation to real objects. A tomb at Tournai. A long-haired king. A disputed origin legend. A fallen dynasty. A medieval chronicle. A genealogy. A village. A seal. Each item is real, or at least real enough to be described. Then the spaces between them are filled with suggestion. The result feels researched because the surface contains names and dates. But research is not the same as arrangement. You can arrange true fragments into a false pattern. That is where the danger lies. A forged or unreliable historical claim rarely announces itself by saying, "Ignore the archive, trust the fantasy." It usually does the opposite. It borrows the tone of scholarship. It surrounds itself with footnotes, charts, old-looking names, heraldic symbols, and references to documents most readers will never inspect closely. It creates the sensation of verification without the discipline of verification. The viewer feels they are seeing behind the curtain, but sometimes the curtain is part of the set. The Priory of Sion material gained cultural force because it operated exactly in that theatrical space between archive and myth. Its claims sounded archival enough to intrigue, but dramatic enough to spread. A genuine medieval charter may be historically valuable, but it is rarely cinematic. A secret dossier implying hidden kings, sacred descent, and guarded truth is immediately cinematic. It almost writes its own trailer. And that matters, because modern legend does not survive on evidence alone. It survives on mood. The Merovingian bloodline myth had a powerful mood. Old Europe, lost monarchy, suppressed Christianity, coded symbols, elite guardians, hidden descendants. It suggested that beneath the visible history of popes, kings, revolutions, and republics, another line had remained unbroken. That promise gave the past a concealed nervous system. Everything could suddenly connect. For people overwhelmed by historical complexity, that kind of connection can be intoxicating. Real history is often unsatisfying in its honesty. It says, "This source is late. This account is biased. This genealogy breaks here. This motive is unclear. This symbol probably meant one thing in one century and another thing in the next." Real history asks for patience. It resists clean answers. It leaves some doors closed, not because a secret society locked them, but because time destroyed the key. Conspiracy history offers a different experience. It says, the door is closed because someone is hiding what is behind it. That is a far more exciting explanation. It turns frustration into pursuit. It turns missing evidence into plot. It turns the historian's caution into the villain's silence. And once a person accepts that absence itself proves concealment, almost nothing can disprove the story. Every objection becomes part of the cover-up. Every failed document becomes a planted distraction. Every expert who refuses the claim becomes another guardian of the lie. That is not investigation. It is a belief system wearing the clothes of research. Still, we should not dismiss the appeal too quickly. The desire behind these stories is not entirely ridiculous. People want the past to matter. They want ancestry to mean something. They want injustice to be corrected, hidden truth to be revealed, and the defeated to be more than defeated. A lost dynasty is emotionally powerful because it suggests that history might have taken the wrong path. Somewhere, perhaps, the true heir survived. Somewhere, the broken line continued. Somewhere, the old king was not really dead. That longing is ancient. You find versions of it in legends of sleeping kings, returning emperors, hidden princes, and chosen bloodlines waiting for the right hour. The Merovingians were simply drawn into this much older human pattern. Their fall made them available. Their distance made them flexible. Their symbols made them luminous. Their obscurity made them easy to misunderstand. And the modern forgeries or unreliable materials gave that longing paperwork. That may be the most important point. Paper changes the feeling of a legend. A tale told around a fire can be dismissed as folklore. A tale typed, filed, stamped, deposited, indexed, and cited begins to feel like evidence, even if it is fraudulent. Modern people trust documents in a way earlier cultures may have trusted lineage, oath, relic, or ritual. So the bloodline myth adapted. It did not present itself only as a marvel. It presented itself as a file. The sea beast became a dossier. The sacred hare became a clue. The lost dynasty became a case. This transformation tells us something profound about modern myth-making. We like to believe we are less mythic than the medieval world. We assume that because we use archives, photographs, databases, and academic language, we are protected from legend. But legends do not disappear when societies become literate. They learn to use literacy. They pass through photocopies, best-selling books, television documentaries, internet forums, and annotated diagrams. They become searchable. A myth with citations can still be a myth. The success of the Merovingian bloodline narrative also depended on the glamour of hidden monarchy. A secret king satisfies two opposite desires at once. He preserves hierarchy because he suggests that some blood really is special. But he also flatters rebellion because recognizing him means rejecting official power. The believer gets to stand against the establishment while still believing in a deeper royal order. It is anti-authority and aristocratic at the same time. That combination is unusually seductive. It allows the modern reader to imagine themselves as both skeptic and initiate. They are not simply accepting a throne. They are discovering the true throne behind the false one. They are not merely believing in kings. They are exposing the counterfeit history that concealed the rightful line. This gives the conspiracy a moral charge. The believer is not daydreaming. They are restoring justice. But justice cannot be built on forged foundations. A hidden king who depends on unreliable documents remains a fantasy, no matter how satisfying the fantasy feels. And yet the fantasy tells us something real. It tells us that the Merovingians remained symbolically charged long after their political meaning had faded. No one builds a successful modern bloodline myth around a dynasty that feels emotionally dead. The story worked because the Merovingians still carried the residue of sacred kingship. Their long hair, their fall, their uncertain origins, their place at the beginning of French monarchy, all of it made them feel like a royal house that had been interrupted rather than merely replaced. The modern imagination mistook interruption for concealment. That mistake is revealing. When we see a dynasty end, we often want to ask where it went. But sometimes the honest answer is brutal. It went nowhere. Its power was absorbed. Its members faded. Its memory was reused by others. That answer feels too final for the human appetite. So myth supplies another ending. The line did not die. It continued in secret. The king was not removed. He was hidden. The past was not lost. It was encrypted. The Merovingians became a screen onto which this hope could be projected. And because their real history was already filled with ritual, blood, baptism, and symbolic bodies, the projection almost seemed to fit. Almost. That word is where responsible storytelling must stand. Almost is not enough. The forged and unreliable modern materials gained traction because they offered a complete story where the evidence offers a complicated one. They gave shape to uncertainty. They gave villains to confusion. They gave heirs to absence. They gave sacred purpose to dynastic accident. They turned the slow, difficult study of early medieval power into a treasure hunt. A treasure hunt is easier to sell, but it is not always easier to respect. The real Merovingians deserve better than to be reduced to props in a modern fantasy. Their world was strange on its own terms, not because it secretly contained a 20th century puzzle box. Their kingship mattered because people believed in lineage, signs, ritual, Christian authority, and embodied legitimacy. Their fall mattered because political reality finally overwhelmed symbolic inheritance. Their afterlife mattered because later societies used them as a foundation, a warning, and eventually a mystery. That is enough. In fact, it is more than enough. The power of the hidden king is not that he proves a secret bloodline exists. It is that he reveals how unwilling we are to accept that history can be both meaningful and unfinished without being secretly planned. We want a design beneath the wreckage. We want a rightful heir beneath the usurper. We want the archive to open, the code to break, the old family to return with the answer. The forged document knows this. It smiles and offers us exactly what we wanted before we knew we wanted it. That is why the Merovingian myth survived scrutiny in popular culture, even after its factual claims were widely rejected. Refutation weakens a historical argument. It does not always weaken a dream, A dream can retreat into mood, metaphor, suspicion, or entertainment. It can say, perhaps not literally, and continue to glow. It can survive as a novel, a theory, a late-night conversation, a video, a half-remembered claim passed from one curious mind to another. This is the final trick of modern legend. Once disproven as fact, it can still remain powerful as atmosphere. And the Merovingians, the old long-haired kings, have always lived dangerously close to atmosphere. They were real. That must be said first. But around them gathered symbols strong enough to outlive the political world that created them. Later forgers and speculative writers did not create that power. They harvested it. They took the buried dynasty, dressed it in modern suspicion, and offered it back to the world as a secret waiting to be uncovered. What they revealed was not the hidden order of history. They revealed the hidden hunger of the present. In the end, the Merovingians leave us with two histories. One is made of kings, the other is made of hunger. The first belongs to late Roman Gaul and the early medieval West, a world of armed followings, bishops, royal graves, divided inheritances, political marriages, monastic exile, and bodies turned into symbols. It is not simple, and it is not clean. It contains ambition, devotion, brutality, improvisation, and the slow work of making authority recognizable in a world where Rome had weakened but had not vanished from memory. The second history belongs to everyone who came after. It belongs to chroniclers who arranged the past into royal sequence, to later monarchies that needed ancient roots, to antiquarians who looked at old names and wondered what had been lost, to modern writers who saw mystery where evidence was thin, to readers who wanted a hidden king beneath the official story. Both histories matter, but they do not matter in the same way. The real Merovingians were not proven guardians of a secret, sacred bloodline. They were not, as far as the evidence can responsibly show, the keepers of some concealed dynasty running beneath European history. The modern claims that tried to turn them into that have been disputed, widely rejected, and often built on foundations too weak to bear the weight placed upon them. That conclusion may disappoint anyone who came looking for a locked chamber, but it should not disappoint anyone who came looking for history. Because the historical Merovingians are already extraordinary. They ruled in a time when kingship was still being negotiated between older Roman habits and newer Frankish power. They rose from uncertain origins, where memory and legend gathered around names like Merovech. They became visible through Childeric's grave, where weapons, ornaments, and a royal signet ring pulled a dynasty out of rumor and into the material world. They reached their great turning point with Clovis, whose conquests and conversion gave Frankish power a Christian future. They divided kingdoms like inheritance and discovered that family blood could become a map of conflict. They produced queens whose influence moved through marriage, motherhood, patronage, and survival. They wore their legitimacy in their hair. That detail remains almost impossible to forget, not because it proves a secret, not because it reveals a supernatural code, but because it shows how deeply political authority could be attached to the visible body of the king. A Merovingian ruler did not merely hold office in the abstract. He appeared as royal. His blood had to be seen, recognized, and ritually protected. And when the time came to remove him, that same symbol had to be destroyed. A haircut ended what armies and councils had prepared. That is not fantasy. That is the real strangeness of the past. We often imagine history becomes more serious when it becomes less symbolic, as if symbols are ornaments placed on top of practical power. The Merovingians teach the opposite. Symbols can be practical. Ritual can change political reality. A body can become an argument. A grave can preserve a claim. A monastery can neutralize a rival. A baptism can turn conquest into Christian kingship. A royal lineage can survive as memory long after it has stopped commanding obedience. The Merovingians matter because they show us power before it became fully institutional in the later sense. Power had to be staged. It had to be believed. It had to be inherited, displayed, blessed, narrated, and sometimes violently edited. Their fall does not erase that achievement. By the time Childeric III was shorn in 751, the dynasty had already shaped the world that replaced it. The Carolingians did not begin with an empty stage. They inherited a language of Christian monarchy that the Merovingians had helped build. They inherited the problem of legitimacy. They inherited the need for blessing. They inherited a realm where kingship had to be both force and symbol. In that sense, the Merovingians lost the crown, but not the consequences of their rule. The question, then, is not whether they secretly survived. The more important question is why they kept returning. They returned because their story sits in a rare place, documented enough to be real, broken enough to invite speculation, strange enough to resist becoming ordinary. They stand near the beginning of France's royal memory, but not in the bright language of later national myth. They belong to the dimmer threshold, where empire gives way to kingdom, where warrior households learn to speak with bishops, where family inheritance becomes political geography, where a king's hair can be more than hair. That threshold is fertile ground for legends, and legends grow especially well around fallen dynasties. A dynasty that continues to rule becomes bureaucracy, law, tax, ceremony, habit. A dynasty that falls becomes possibility. Its ending creates space. What if a child escaped? What if the line continued? What if the true heir was hidden? What if the official story was not the last word? These questions can be irresponsible when treated as evidence, but they are understandable as human impulses. We do not like endings that feel too final. We prefer disappearance to extinction. We prefer concealment to loss. We prefer a hidden pattern to the untidy fact that power changes hands, families fade, and history does not always preserve what we wish it had preserved. The Merovingians became a place where those preferences could gather. But separating history from legend does not mean stripping the story of wonder. It means placing the wonder where it belongs. The wonder is not that the Merovingians secretly ruled from behind the curtain. The wonder is that they ruled openly through a mixture of blood, belief, fear, ritual, and memory so powerful that even their removal had to be performed with symbolic precision. The wonder is that a grave dug in Tournai could still speak after centuries, that a baptism could reshape the destiny of a warrior dynasty, that queens, often filtered through hostile or anxious sources, could still be seen at the center of survival, that a sea beast legend, marked as, could reveal not a biological secret, but a political imagination hungry for sacred origins, that a shorn king could become the final image of an entire royal house, and that long after the last Merovingian throne was empty, the dynasty remained available to dreamers, forgers, scholars, monarchists, skeptics, novelists, and late-night storytellers. This is what remains of the long-haired kings, not proof of a hidden sacred bloodline, not a solved code, not a secret monarchy sleeping beneath Europe. What remains is a real dynasty that became legendary because its reality was already charged with symbols. The Merovingians did not need to be invented from nothing. They only needed to be remembered, and each age remembered them for its own reasons. The early Middle Ages remembered them as rulers. Later France remembered them as origins. Modern conspiracy culture remembered them as a missing key. We may remember them more carefully. We can see them as men and women living in a fractured world, using the tools available to them. Swords, marriages, baptisms, patronage, ancestry, ritual humiliation, and public signs. We can see how they built power, how they lost it, and how their memory escaped the control of those who had once carried the name. That may be the most honest ending. The Merovingians did not keep a secret history hidden from us. They became a secret history because we kept looking at them and sensing that power, once wrapped in blood and ritual, never entirely becomes ordinary again. A dynasty can be buried. A legend learns to breathe underground, and somewhere, between the grave of Childeric and the shorn head of the last king, the old mystery remains, not as proof of a conspiracy, but as a reminder that history is never made only from what happened. It is also made from what people could not stop believing about what happened.